Okay, alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 173. I am your host, Panyobasa, and I've got to rearrange some stuff on the computer screen here. Oh, and I forgot to increase the size of the font so I'm not like squinting at it totally. Like this. Okay. Not exactly on the ball right now. Okay. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 173. I'm your host, Panyobasa, and yes, indeed, 173 is a prime number. The only two positive integers that multiply together to produce 173 are 1 times 173. This is my beverage, and this is kind of an exciting change of pace. I mean, this could go down in Q&A history because this is the first time my designated beverage for this show is hot cocoa. Because we're getting into that time of season. You know, there's like fake Christmas trees and stuff behind me now. It's wintertime. It's getting down below zero here in the deep south, which is just kind of weird. I come from the Pacific Northwest, way farther north than here, and it doesn't freeze as much in the wintertime there just because of prevailing westerlies and so forth. Wind coming up off the ocean instead of off the land mass. So let's see here. I guess I covered the prime number issue, the hot cocoa issue, so let's just dive right into this. And the first question, oh, by the way, it's not going to be an extremely long one, so you don't have to go make sure you have to pee or anything before watching this, because it'd probably be 2 hours or less. You can go pee anyway, just pause it or something. We're not going to wait for you. So anyways, first question is from Romeo. And Romeo says, working in the mental health field, I find that wellness trends with their roots in Eastern spirituality frequently become all the rage. Mindfulness from Buddhism, of course, is still very popular, but the latest trend to catch on are various breathing techniques, which they collectively refer to as breathwork. After a little digging, I found that breathwork is just the modern Western iteration of pranayama, the ancient Hindu tradition involving various techniques of breath control. What do you know of pranayama breathing techniques, their history, benefits, etc.? Well, I do know that according to the legend of the Buddha's quest for enlightenment before he became the Buddha, that he did practice pranayama, like holding his breath so that, for very long periods of time, or breathing so slowly that like the devas couldn't tell if he was breathing or not, that kind of thing. And that was one of those things that the Buddha decided just wasn't helping. And so Theravada Buddhism, anyway, I don't know of any Buddhist school that really practices pranayama in an orthodox or orthoprax manner. Yet Theravada Buddhism just does not do pranayama or breath control. You're just supposed to breathe naturally. There are a few sort of heterodox or heteroprax teachers out there within Theravada, like Venerable Tangidong Sayadaw. I don't know if he's still alive or not, but I attended one of his retreats at Isi Pinya Dewa Guru Jaun in the old city of Pagan. And part of his breathing or his like mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of breathing instructions in the Tangidong method is breathe a little harder than usual. And the reason he gives is that if you breathe a little harder than usual, then you have to use more mental application to attend to the breath. It's slightly artificial, so that you have to have to attend to it and deliberately keep it going, sort of like Om. That's one good thing about Om is, it requires a certain volitional effort to keep it going, unlike just regular breathing, because you can be unconscious, or at least in a deep sleep or a coma or something, and still be breathing. Your mind can just completely wander away from the breath, and you don't even notice it because your mind is wandered away. So what happened at Tenji Seattle's retreats, and some of his senior disciples, like veteran Tenji meditators, they were breathing about as fast as they possibly could. They were essentially hyperventilating. And then people would just start popping off, like howling like dogs, or laughing uncontrollably, or crying uncontrollably, or just yelling, this kind of stuff. And Tenji Seattle, bless his heart, in his innocence, I suppose, was calling that piti, which is one of the 7 factors of enlightenment. But it seemed to me that it was hyperventilation, that they were just getting drunk on oxygen. So let's see here. I told the Seattle that, and he was just kind of sort of grinning in amusement. It's like, these Western barbarians, the strange ideas they get. You breathe as hard as you possibly can so that the meditation hall sounds like a textile mill, just chugga, 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 chugga. All these people just essentially panting as hard as they can. And then they're howling like dogs, unlike other meditation retreats I went to. So, almost needless to say, I didn't last very long at that Tenji meditation retreat. It just seemed like just a funny farm or something. And what was even worse is that one of his senior disciples, who was a rich man who donated the monastery, which is probably pretty expensive, inside the city of Pagan, the ancient capital of Burma. When someone would start like acting weird, like laughing uncontrollably or flopping around, this kind of stuff, he'd be right there with a video camera. And it was like, not only did I not want to start howling like a dog, but I did not want to be howling like a dog on the 6 o'clock news in Burma because of this guy filming me while I was doing it. So that really kind of handicapped my practice, so to speak. So in Theravada Buddhism, as far as I know, there is no orthodox teachings of pranayama. It's not one of the 40 methods that are traditionally taught, like in the Visuddhimagga. It's just not there. Just mindfulness of breathing is there, which is like one of the main meditation techniques in Theravada Buddhism. But you breathe normally. And as you get into deeper and deeper meditation, you require less oxygen, apparently. And so your breathing becomes more and more subtle, until some people, they'll get to the point where they can't really even note the breathing anymore because it's so subtle. It's not registering enough sensation for them to really perceive it easily. So, I mean, it's sort of spontaneous, natural kind of breath reduction as you get into deeper and deeper meditative states, when you become just less and less, your metabolism just kind of gets a lot less, let's say. So let's see, what do I know of pranayama breathing techniques, their history, benefits, etc.? From the Buddhist point of view, there is not enough benefit really to warrant practicing it, because, I mean, just the Buddha in his eclectic experimentation before his enlightenment, he tried it, he mastered it, and it just didn't get him enlightened, so he moved on to something else. So pranayama, I'm pretty sure it's mainly a yoga thing, which started off as Sankhya, a non-Vedic philosophy, in the same sort of Shramana fold as Buddhism and Jainism and the extinct Ajivakism. And then it got at least some of the followers of capital Y yoga decided to join the proto-Hindus, declare the Vedas authoritative, and so it's now called yoga, even though its origins were outside of Vedism. And they probably are the ones who are mainly doing breath control. That's my guess. I'm no expert on it. I've never really practiced breath control other than, like, as a teenager, just kind of experimenting with stuff. You read about something in a Ram Dass book, so you try it, that kind of thing. There has been breath work going on for quite a while, though. I mean, it's different from what Romeo here is describing, but I remember reading like back in the 1990s, I think, that a certain Stan Grof at the Esalen Institute was using so-called breath work, but for him it was kind of like the Tanjidon method, where you were just hyperventilating essentially in order to induce altered states of consciousness. He switched over to breath work after LSD and other psychedelics were outlawed in America, so it was like a substitute for psychedelics in his case. So yeah, I would guess that the history, I mean, in the text, the Buddha himself, before he became the Buddha, was trying it. Presumably he mastered it. He got to the point where he was almost not breathing anymore. And it's just not really a Theravada Buddhist thing. And I'm not, I'm no authority on it. But probably its origins go back into probably prehistoric times, which, I mean, isn't super early in India, because history in India wasn't really recorded. I mean, you've got the Rig Veda is the earliest Indian document. Some of it is so early that apparently it was composed before the Indo-Aryans made it into what in ancient times anyway was considered to be India, which might now just be Pakistan. So let's see. The benefits of pranayama, I'm really not sure. I mean, if you're like forcibly reducing your breath, it could sort of have the converse of like natural breathing in Theravada mindfulness of breathing, where when your concentration gets deep enough, you just breathe less. So it may be the other way around, that the yogis are just breathing less as a way of increasing the concentration, because you get less oxygen to your brain, and so less energy to your brain, which would then be a kind of samatha method, I suppose. Aside from that, I'm not sure what the benefits of pranayama would be. It can be dangerous. I have come across warnings that pranayama without a qualified teacher, you're like too much oxygen deprivation to your brain can cause brain damage, stuff like that. So yeah, it is kind of an esoteric thing. It's sort of like Kundalini meditation, where if you don't have like a skilled guide, you're better off not just trying it from a book or a YouTube video. And I'm really not sure what Romeo is referring to with regard to like the newest, esoteric Eastern health fad that is this being such a big deal. I mean, it could be just a way of like causing greater calmness, reducing stress, something like that. But yeah, it is true that mindfulness really has just, it's one aspect of Theravada Buddhism that has just gone mainstream in Western culture, because a lot of hospitals, for example, are teaching mindfulness. Lots of just big corporations are teaching mindfulness, like I think Google and places like that, where we're teaching mindfulness practices to their employees, mainly as a way of improving morale and improving like productivity and reducing sick time, which is just makes more profits for the company. But in hospitals, they will teach a kind of secularized mindfulness to people dealing with chronic pain, like burn victims or so forth. Also people dealing with like the potentiality of imminent decease, like people with advanced cancer and that sort of thing. They get taught mindfulness techniques a lot nowadays in hospitals that are not run by Buddhists. It's just sort of like a, what's the word? Eclectic, sort of like the ancient Romans, where if they came across anything that worked really well, especially along the lines of like the military, they would adopt it. And, the West is kind of famous for that too. We're very eclectic and are willing to absorb elements of other cultures if it happens to work, if it happens to be beneficial. Why the hell not? Which is fine. So I guess I've pretty much exhausted my knowledge of pranayama with this answer. So I'm going to move on to Romeo's second question. And this is all regarding pranayama. He says, do you have any personal experience with any specific pranayama breathing techniques that you can recommend as particularly beneficial? And no. The only personal experience with specific pranayama breathing techniques, or the thing that comes closest to it, aside from maybe a few experiments as like a 17-year-old, would be the Tanjidon method. And it just was not for me. It was, in a way, just like conjuring up fake piti, or like exhilaration, enthusiasm, through hyperventilation. So, let's see. I guess I answered that one easily enough because I already answered that in response to the first question. So, the third question from Romeo is, did the Buddha personally use or recommend any breathing techniques outside of breath meditation? And yeah, I pretty much answered all three of Romeo's questions in my meandering answer to the first question, that the Buddha, before his enlightenment, experimented with advanced pranayama so that his breathing pretty much stopped. Not just spontaneous, like when you hit fourth jhana, supposedly your breathing almost stops, like you're a hibernating squirrel. But with pranayama, it's more of a deliberate, conscious like effort or technique to slow down your breathing. And so the Buddha was experimenting with that before his enlightenment and came to the conclusion that it was not really helpful in that regard. And so he dismissed it, and it's just not part of Theravada Buddhism. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Newman. And Newman says, how common were parasites and diseases in daily life in Burma? How did you avoid them? Well, you can't completely avoid them in some place like Burma. You're living, just out in some forest in rural Burma, surrounded by people with very rudimentary concept of like general hygiene. I mean, they would bathe. The women would bathe with clothes on. Like an adult Burmese female traditionally is never all the way naked. They have this way of, they got like a bathing sarong. They put that over the top of the regular clothes. They shuck out of the regular clothes, take a bath with the bathing sarong on, and then they do a similar thing. They put the clothes on and then kind of shuck the bathing sarong out so that they're never all the way unclothed. But aside from that, they just really don't have much idea of like germ theory. It's just never really made it into the mainstream of traditional Burmese village culture. Just the idea of microbes, pathogenic microbes, that kind of thing. They don't really think about that sort of thing. So anyways, parasites, you've got different kinds of parasites. You've got internal ones and external ones. The internal ones were mainly like intestinal worms, pinworms. That was very common in Burma. Probably most of the people in Burmese villages have pinworms pretty frequently, including monks who are depending for alms on these people. And I remember there was this Korean monk who was living at Tongpulu Chaltsindoya. It's one of a very rough, like ascetic kind of monastery that I was staying at. And he used to be like a professional dancer, and he was afraid of geckos. He was afraid of any kind of snakes, even like the harmless little palm snakes. He just was not cut out for living in this really rough kind of desert monastery. And he was just freaking out the first time he noticed that he had pinworms. It's like you notice what came out of the back end, and it's got like little white worms wriggling in it, and he was just totally freaking out. But as a general rule, a Western monk especially always should carry a first aid kit when he is living in the tropics, in a forest, not in a city where you've got easy access to doctors and so forth, but have a pretty well-equipped first aid kit, like 2 different kinds of antibiotics, like tetracycline, and then something like, what would be just a more broad spectrum kind of antibiotic. You always have to have malaria pills. I mean, if I didn't have malaria pills, I'd be dead several times over now. And you should always have some dewormer, because you're going to get pinworms if you live out in a Burmese forest. It's just the way it goes. So, yeah, just a dewormer. That I had a doctor advise me to take a dewormer like twice a year just in case, because it's so easy to pick up intestinal worms when you're living in Burma, especially out in a forest area. But even if you're just relying on like manual laborers and so forth in the cities for your alms, still you can get pinworms pretty easily. And that's my experience. Like even in Rangoon, I mean, you're relying more on like the servants and so forth than you are on the rich people. Like the rich people, they're living in a great big house with like this big closed gate. And you stand out front of the closed gate and nobody sees you, and then you move on until you get into some little squalid ghetto kind of environment where a lot of the manual laborers and some of the servants and so forth are living. And then they're living like in a village. There's the front door is wide open, everybody sees who's standing out in front and everything. So still you get the dewormer and you just keep it in your first aid kit and maybe take it twice a year. There was one kind of dewormer that was from India that I kind of liked. It had a warning on it. You may have strange dreams when you take this. And it did. It just caused these really weird, surreal kind of dreams. With regard to external parasites, I mean, that's like a whole book worth of information on those. There's like mosquitoes and bed bugs would be two of the main ones. Fleas. Also like sand flies, horse flies. I mean, those are all parasites. And bed bugs. I'd never seen a bed bug before I went to Burma. And so I got, my cave got infested with them. And I thought they were like baby cockroaches. I was like looking in the little garbage pot, seeing if there's anything the cockroaches were eating and multiplying with. And then one day, one of these bed bugs audaciously is just walking right across this book I was reading. And so instead of blowing it off, I just kind of flicked it off like this, and it popped and splattered bright red blood onto the book. I think I still have the book back there. And I have a degree in biology, and I know that insects don't have bright red blood, but that I do. And so then I knew, it's bed bugs, some kind of parasitic bugs. I just came to the conclusion it must be bed bugs. And it was a bitch getting rid of them, especially as a monk when you're not supposed to be killing anything. So I was like taking everything out. They liked the inside of hardbound books, like inside the spine. They would lay their eggs inside the spine, or they would just hide there. They like hiding in crevices during the day. I was just taking everything out. You can take your mats and put them out in the sun, that kind of thing. And then everything else, I just take it out and inspect it and blow any bed bugs off of it and then bring it back in again. That ritual went on for like 2 weeks. It sucked. Also living in the forest, there's like ticks. They say if a tick bites you, you're not supposed to just pull it off because the head can break off under the skin and it can get worse and stuff. But I just pull it right off. But I guess what happened was the head must have broken off underneath the skin or something, because it got worse for like 2 weeks, more and more painful, more inflamed, and then finally it kind of disappeared. So, I mean, mosquitoes, there's not much, like especially as a monk, you're not even allowed to slap mosquitoes. So, but then that leads to disease. And of course, the main dangerous disease you can get in Burma is malaria, which is caused by the bite of mosquitoes. So those two go hand in hand. And that's one of the things you have to have in your first aid kit if you're going to be like a forest monk in Burma or probably other tropical Asian countries. Anti-malaria medicine. I also had one kind of hepatitis A. One doctor diagnosed it as amoebic hepatitis, where dysentery amoebas had invaded my liver. Another doctor said it's probably just something I ate, which is, I guess that was it, because I didn't notice that I even had dysentery. Dysentery is another one. Strangely, I never had dysentery. Never had cholera. I remember there was one Australian monk who sometimes would talk about the time when he had malaria, cholera, and TB all at the same time. He said he spent the entire rainy season on his back. And with malaria, like the main medications for malaria, at least when I was living in Burma, were based on, what is it? quinine or quinine. I'll call it quinine because I'm American. And some of those medications, the symptoms are almost as bad as the disease. I mean, it's just, you're just out of it. It's just like weird, like kind of nausea and just sort of like dizziness and ringing in your ears, and just, it's not good. Fortunately, I never had cholera. Although I had giardiasis once, just from drinking like unfiltered creek water, just way the hell out in the sticks. This was up on the Chindwin River, like halfway up the Chindwin River. I was drinking this creek water, and apparently that's how I got giardiasis. But that's another thing, like metronidazole, another kind of pill that you should keep in your first aid kit if you're a forest-dwelling Western monk in tropical Asia, because that takes out, metronidazole takes out, what does it take out? Takes out giardiasis. I think it takes out amoebic dysentery. And also there's trichomoniasis or something like that I've never had and don't have any experience with. But it's like an anti-protozoan, not like an antibacteria thing like antibiotics are. So how do you avoid them? I mean, just general cleanliness and carefulness. But I mean, you can't completely avoid, like, mosquitoes. Good luck completely avoiding mosquitoes in Burma. Even the mosquitoes in Rangoon are even worse than the ones in the forest, because forest mosquitoes have like a Geneva Convention. They mostly just come out early in the morning and then like at dusk. Dusk is like mosquito happy hour. And it's like during the bright daytime, they're avoiding the diurnal, the daytime hunters of mosquitoes, and in the middle of the night they're avoiding the bats. So there's just like this little window when the mosquitoes can just run amok, after the daytime predators have pretty much stopped, and before the nighttime predators have really gotten into full swing, then the mosquitoes come out, and it's awful. But in Rangoon, there's no Geneva Convention. It's just mosquitoes 24/7. So, I mean, to some degree, a monk just has to be patient. I could never fully be patient with horseflies, though. It's just, I could not just sit there and be bitten by horseflies. So, in that case, I did swat them with my sweat rag. And I got really, at first, it would just kind of scare them away. You kind of ding them, it kind of rings their bell and they'll fly away. But I eventually got so much practice at it that, you got a horsefly here. You get the sweat rag and come from behind, so that there's like this whiplash effect, and it snaps it really fast, and it started actually killing them. So I would compensate for my bad karma for killing a horsefly or a sandfly by feeding them to antlions. There's antlion pits all over inside this cave that I lived in. And if you don't know what antlions are, it's some sort of insect larva or nymph that, I mean, it looks sort of like a stonefly or something, or a caddisfly when it's full grown, but it digs this pit that's like a funnel, and it's loose sand, and anything like an ant or any other kind of insect can fall into that, and then the antlion at the bottom just starts flinging sand at it to knock it down, and then it grabs it with its big pincher jaws and devours it. So, anyways, getting back to the question, parasites and diseases, I mean, you use a little common sense, try and stay away from, don't be like standing still outdoors at dusk, that kind of thing. I mean, you're kind of at the mercy of the people who give you food with regard to things like intestinal worms. I mean, you're probably just going to get those, and so you just take the dewormer and that kind of thing. And with regard to diseases, just protect Dhamma. Dhamma will protect you to some degree. I had falciparum malaria like 7 or 8 times when I was in Burma. So, I mean, in a case like that, it's just, you can just avoid the endemic areas, which is avoiding real forests. Wherever you have real forest, you've got real malaria. So, I guess aside from just being tough, stoic, or whatever, being a good Buddhist, then you just have to deal with it. I mean, you can just try to use some common sense and have a well-equipped first aid kit. Fortunately, in Burma, there's almost no prescription drugs. You want antibiotics, you can just get antibiotics. You want malaria medication, you can just get malaria medication. Relatively cheap, although in Burma there is a certain amount of counterfeit drugs. Like especially something like ampicillin or amoxicillin. There have been times when I would take it and it would have no effect whatsoever. And a lot of it is like counterfeit stuff that just has like chalk in it instead of actual medicine inside the capsules. So you got to be careful about that. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Thought Fog. And Thought Fog says, do you have investments? What are your thoughts on investing? And the only investment I have is I've got a 401k. The company I work for is very generous in matching 401k. So, so long as civilization doesn't collapse or the economy doesn't collapse, or just rampant inflation like in the Weimar Republic doesn't happen in America, it's probably, at least treading water, just sort of keeping up with inflation at least. But I've really never been particularly money oriented. I've kind of taken to heart the idea of, consider the lilies of the field, that kind of thing. Give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat or where you will sleep. Like, I really do not like the idea of insurance. The only reason I've got health insurance now, which is cheap from where I'm working, is my woman insists upon it. Otherwise, I might just have like accident insurance. I squish my hand at work or something, that might get paid for. If I had to do it all over again, I think I'd be buying gold. But that's not exactly any kind of financial advice there. So investing, if you're into, that's fine. Doesn't matter to me. But I do think that there is some real wisdom in what the Buddha and Jesus were both teaching. Just give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat, where you will sleep. God will provide, or Dhamma will provide. Your own karma will give you what you need. So let's see here. I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And he says, what are your thoughts on Freemasonry? And I've never been a Freemason. I knew when I was like in junior high school, my best friend was the son of a Freemason. And he was, my friend was in D-Malay, I guess, which is like it's sort of like the Freemason youth. He liked it because you get a sword, which is nice. But he seems not to have known anything about Freemasonry either. About half of what I know about Freemasonry, I picked up from the book War and Peace by some guy named Tolstoy. He talks about how Pierre Bezahov becomes a Freemason, and it talks about like the initiation ceremony and so forth. So I know about that. It's some kind of secret society, supposedly benevolent. They help each other. But if they have some kind of New World Order agenda or anything like that, I really don't know. So, yeah, Freemasonry is just kind of on the outskirts of my perceptual field. I really don't have any kind of significant interactions with Freemasons that I'm aware of. Nobody's tried to give me a secret handshake or anything like that. So, I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Stellar Supreme et al. Changes his name pretty often. So let's just call him Stellar Supreme et al. And leave it at that. And he says, were you ever chased by a snake? And I have mentioned once when I was walking from One Bow Village, walking back from One Bow Village after going for alms. So I've got my full alms bowl. I'm walking back to the monastery. And right in this dirt road that I would walk on, there was a baby Russell's viper, the deadliest snake in Burma. Not the most venomous, but just like the meanest and most likely to cause death by snake bite. It was only like 1.5 feet long, but partly just as a way of scaring me away, which is kind of the strategy of Russell's vipers and vipers in general, maybe. It just started like lunging at me and like coming after me like this. I had to walk way around it. And even after I get past it, it's still coming after me. But it wasn't like trying to chase me down so it could bite me. It's just trying to get me to fuck off and leave it alone. But I mean, I've walked right past Russell's vipers. They're sort of like a copperhead in their coloration. They're very well camouflaged. They're just the color of dead leaves. They just blend right in with the dead leaves. And I've walked right past them before. Like I remember once I was going up the hill to get up onto the dirt road so I could head to One Bow Village for alms. And I just heard this little like a sound. And I looked down and I was my foot was like this far away from the head of a Russell's viper. You know, it was just giving me fair warning, just like, don't fuck with me. I'm here. And you better be way over there soon. But the only time I was ever really chased by a snake was, that little baby Russell's viper. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme at All's next question. He says, is being anti-establishment the new wave of based? Well, I wouldn't say any kind of anti-establishment would be the new wave of based. You know, you've got some sort of conservative establishment, so then anti-establishment could be Marxism, and Marxism is not particularly based. So I think based is mainly just not so much anti-establishment as just anti-political correctness, anti-cultural Marxism. It seems like that is just what based originally meant and still means as far as I know. You know, you're based in reality instead of this kind of hysterical, feminized, irrational, emotion-based beliefs. At least it's emotion based on the rank and file of the people that believe it. There may be some cynical people that don't believe it that are the ones who are generating a lot of it or endorsing it, you know, trying to promulgate it. So, I don't think necessarily being anti-establishment in and of itself is the new wave of based. I think just being like anti-diversity or anti-feminism or anti-Marxism, that kind of thing, is and always was based, as long as the word based has been in the working English vocabulary, which hasn't been for very long. It's been like 10 or 12 years that people have been saying based, I guess. So let's see here. I guess I'll just move on to Stellar Supreme at All's next question. Got any recommendations for reducing liminality? Yeah, so Stellar Supreme apparently might be contemplating the possibility that he is a little too liminal. So he wants to be less liminal, less kind of surreal in his existence. And I mean, if you want to be less liminal, you got to be more mainstream. You got to be a normie. Just be as much of a normie as possible. Just follow all the rules, follow all the social norms, take them seriously. You know, talk to people about sports and cars and stuff. That would reduce liminality. It's kind of difficult for a person who is genuinely, just by temperament, a liminal person, just kind of on the fringe of normality. But I mean, you could take steps. I mean, just stop doing any kind of liminal activities. Stay away from Ouija boards, for example. You know, just think like a normie, or, you know, behave as much as possible like a normie, which will then kind of reduce the liminality. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to the next one. This is from Cleefy, who is a Lithuanian person. And I'm unaware of there being any derogatory slurs for Lithuanians. Maybe the Russians have them. But in America, Lithuanian people are just called Lithuanians. And that's good. That is the way it should be. So anyways, Cleefy, who is a Lithuanian, says, why do you think Lithuanian is this close to Sanskrit? Lithuania is thousands of kilometers. I use the Star Trek precedent of saying kilometers away from the Indian subcontinent. So, I was recently talking about how, somebody wanted to know what if in any like European language there is, what would be the closest to the Sanskrit word dharma? And I would say probably Lithuanian just because Lithuanian and the Indic languages are very similar in certain ways, just like amazingly similar in certain ways. And it turns out, according to Cleefy, the Lithuanian like equivalent to Dharma would be called Dharna, which means order. So I've read that Lithuanian is the most conservative Indo-European language, which means it has changed the least since ancient times, since the diaspora of Indo-Europeans spread, presumably from the Pontic steppe, but maybe somewhere else. And so Lithuanian is just a very conservative Indo-European language that hasn't changed much. It has changed less than the other Indo-European languages. One reason for that is because they migrated north. They weren't migrating into an already established civilization where there are going to be lots of loan words and so forth. They migrated up into the this godforsaken hellscape of the north, where it was like sparsely populated, and so there was less external influence causing like changes in the language. Maybe there are other reasons for it too. And then for some reason, I'm not exactly sure why, but the Indic languages also are like the second most conservative language group. After Balto-Slavonic, which would include Slavic languages, you've got the Indo-Persian languages, which would include Iranian and like Sanskrit and Pali and numerous other languages that they didn't change much either. And my guess for that, especially with regard to the Indic languages, is that it was sort of like a ruling class language. It's like from the Yamnaya civilization, just going with the standard theory of the spread of Indo-European languages and European peoples, European culture, ethnicity, DNA, whatever. They started off like in the steppes north of the Black Sea, and then one group migrated kind of eastwards and became Sintashta culture, where they invented the war chariot and so forth, allegedly. Then they moved farther east, became the Andronovo culture. And then the Andronovo culture, some of that migrated south into what is now like Afghanistan and became the BMOC, not BOC, which is Blue Oyster Cult, but no, BMAC. There you go, BMAC. It was the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, something like that. And then that was where they really became Indic, started speaking like what would be recognizably an Indian kind of language. And then some of them actually migrated way westward and became the ruling class of a group called the Mitanni that lived in like around what is now Syria. This was in ancient times, in maybe 1500 BC. And then a lot of the rest migrated down into India, where it may be that every single place they went, they were like the ruling class that just kind of disdained the language of the plebs. And so they kind of were conservative that way, even though they were invading other cultures where there'd be lots of loan words. Still, just sort of ethnic pride or something in their particular version of the Indo-European culture just kept them more kind of isolated, less willing to accept lots of loan words and make grammatical changes in their language and so forth. But also, I have read that there was like an Indo-Persian, like Scythian tribes that were speaking like an Indo-Persian language, more Persian than Indo, I think, that then migrated farther west again, like from Andronovo back westward. And they became like a ruling class of a group of people that the Romans called Sarmatians. They were sort of like Proto-Slavic, Proto-Baltic, maybe farther northward and westward. And so there could be some actual connection in language between like the Indo-Persian subgroup and the Balto-Slavonic subgroup. So there could be some connection that way also. But I think the main reason is just that Lithuanian and the Indic languages are both relatively conservative, so they didn't really influence each other very much. one way or the other. It's just that they changed the least and stayed closer to the original language for different reasons. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui said, would you view the Sangha as a mere trampoline to further spiritual adventures? That is, a locus to receive transmission of Dhamma and be on one's way. Well, I don't know if Rui is referring to this like to me personally or in general. I mean, for me personally, the Sangha, being in the Sangha, being an ordained monk for 30 years wasn't just a trampoline for further spiritual adventures. I mean, I learned a lot. It was definitely an invaluable education that you learn not just intellectually, but just through living it. So I wouldn't consider it a locus to receive transmission of Dhamma and be on one's way. Although in my case, I got as much as apparently I was going to get out of it in this lifetime. So then it was like, when it stops working, I stopped making progress for several years, then it just makes sense to try something else. So that was the way it worked for me. I mean, it's not going to work the same for everybody, though. So for some people, it might be that way. And then for some people, it won't. But I don't think the Sangha is a mere trampoline to further spiritual adventures. It's sort of like, there was that Hermann Hesse novel, or is it just Hesse? Narcissus and Goldman, where this is like in medieval England, probably like medieval Germany or Austria, Hermann Hesse or Hesse spoke German. So probably it was a medieval Catholic monastery in his part of the world. And these two friends, Narcissus and Goldman, who are raised like at this monastery boys' school kind of orphanage sort of place. And Narcissus decides he's going to just be ordained and stay there, whereas Goldman is just itching to get out there and taste the world. And so he just immediately goes out and starts like committing adultery and fornicating and all this kind of stuff, winds up getting bubonic plague and coming back to the monastery to be nursed in his final days by his old buddy Narcissus. And you could tell that Hermann Hesse or Hesse was secretly rooting for Goldman, the one who wanted to, he got his monastic training and then went out and started sowing wild oats and so forth. But yeah, it's not the way it's supposed to work. It's like you renounce the world for good and you don't want to just fall back into it. But for some people, I mean, for most people, especially most Westerners who are ordained, that's the way it generally works out. They don't last nearly as long as 30 years. They might last 5 years or so. But it's going to be different for different people. But it really wasn't that way for me. It was just invaluable. My time as a monk was really invaluable in helping me to just open my eyes with regard to a lot of things. But as I say, I got as far as it seemed like I was going to get with it. I had stopped making progress for several years. And so I just decided, well, it's time to try something else. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's next question. He says, as soon as he's referring to the previous Q&A, he says, as soon as you said the words symbolic book burnings of the Biden administration, my computer, a fairly potent Apple machine, crashed. In fact, it crashes every time I play your videos, always somewhere between the 30 to 40 minute mark. And yeah, it should have happened by now. Is or has anyone been experiencing the same problem? It's been going on for the past 2 years, week on week, and only with this channel. So it's apparently some kind of karmic thing. You've got some sort of bad karma that's resisting hearing what I have to say, I guess, and so it's causing glitches in the matrix. That would be a guess. I've had weird karma. Like when I was in Burma, I just had really weird technology karma. Of course, in Burma, stuff breaks down all the time anyway. But man, it was just really awful. Just some of the stuff. You're riding on a bus, suddenly the whole drive line just falls out onto the highway. That kind of thing. It was just too common. The bus hits a cow. So So I haven't really heard from other people about this. It may be just running rampant and I just don't even know about it. But I've had like the similar sort of like technological malfunctions when recording these videos, especially before I got this, what is it, OBS? Yeah, OBS. This seems to work fairly reliably. Before that, I was using just the default video recording software that comes on Apple computers, and it was just continually. One time I had to do the same Q&A 3 times because it said it's recording, and then I tried to review the recording afterwards, and it just says, it's just empty file. So I have had similar kind of problems while recording these things. Just the sound cuts out halfway through. That happened not very long ago. Yeah, I think it's still working now. I got to check the green bar. Yeah, it's going side to side like it's supposed to. Like a good boy. Okay, so yeah, it may be that other people are experiencing the same problem. Maybe they can chime in the comments. But yeah, other than that, it just sounds like a karmic thing. For me, everything is a karmic thing anyway. You just have some sort of deep resistance to learning what I'm saying. But then again, apparently there's some deep resistance. It's like karmic, it's not like a conscious thing necessarily. But yeah, I've had some karmic glitches that have just kind of messed up entire Q&As so that I've had to redo the entire Q&A. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenodemon. And Xenodemon, or Xenodemon, says, does Buddhism have any guidelines on political structures? Or was the Buddha's setting of the pathocracy just a practical means of organizing those that heard his words? Well, the Buddha did give advice, like political advice. There's like a strange sutta in the Digha Nikaya where the Buddha is saying that a good king should like subsidize farmers. He should give them seed grain and so forth to help them get started in business, so that they can, support themselves and their families and contribute to society and all that. So some like modern Westerners have like pointed to these kind of things and say, well, the Buddha, he was a woke socialist. The Buddha did prefer a kind of democracy. That's why he set up the Sangha as a democracy. It's more radical of a democracy, or at least it was set up originally to be more radical of a democracy than we've got like in the West. For example, in order for the Sangha to agree to anything officially, every single member of the Sangha that is participating in the ceremony, like all the inhabitants of that monastery, have to agree. So it's consensus. It's not democratic majority. It's not just the abbot says so, which is the way it generally works in Thailand and Burma now. They've kind of rejected the ancient Indo-European democratic ideal in favor of just kingship. The Sayadaw, the abbot, is king. What he says goes. And it's just unthinkable for some junior monk to just like throw a monkey wrench into some formal act by just speaking out and saying, no, I don't consent to this. This is absurd. But being a Western barbarian, I was inclined to do that a few times. Just like one time at this monastery I was staying at, technically I was a senior monk even at the time. I was sort of a newcomer though. But they were going to have a katina ceremony. And in Burma, the katina ceremony has degenerated into just business, essentially. It's just like the main donation collecting time of year. And it's not done according to Vinaya at all. It has nothing to do with Vinaya. The katina ceremony, originally, it was kind of a test. After spending the 3 months of the rains retreat together, the monks are still like on cooperative terms enough that they can accomplish a difficult task, which is to make a new robe from scratch in 24 hours, in less than 24 hours. They've got to measure the cloth and cut it and sew it and like they got to dye it the correct color and everything, all of that before dawn of the following day. Then they get these katina privileges, which includes the right to keep extra cloth. In addition to the 3 robes that a monk is supposed to keep, you can keep extra ones, that kind of thing. But most monks in Burma, probably most monks in Thailand, they just keep extra robes anyway. They're keeping these hard-earned katina privileges all year round. They don't even need the katina ceremony because they don't really give a damn about those rules anyway. It's just we get lots of donations on that day, and so they like katina festivals, and I just refuse. I just no. We're not going to have a katina festival. So they start trying to like maneuver behind my back, trying to get people to, they're trying to get the katina ceremony going. And I just finally said, look, if you want a katina festival, you're going to wind up with a battle. You want a katain pue, you're going to get a sit pue. The word for battle in Burmese literally means like war festival. So let's see here. In Burma, I mean, really almost every single ceremony, official act of the Sangha is corrupt in just sometimes almost beyond recognition. Like the last uposatha day of the rains retreat is not an uposatha day, it's the invitation day. It's the pawarana day. And where all the monks, they ask the Sangha, out of compassion, please tell me my faults so that I can correct them. And in Burma, you just do not answer. You just do not answer this invitation. Do not point out anybody else's faults, because in Burma, it's like 98% of the monks are just laden with them. They don't even try to follow the rules. And so it's just barbaric. It's just unthinkable that you try to answer another monk's request, his invitation, to point out his lapses from virtue. And I tried it a couple times, and it was like the abbot was just like frantically waving his hand at me to shut up. And it was like he thought maybe I was just speaking out of turn, that I was just didn't know that it wasn't my turn yet to make the bogus invitation. But I'm just completely digressing all over the place. So, does Buddhism have any guidelines on political structures? You can find a few guidelines on political structures in the text. Like there's that one sutta in the Digha Nikaya that is of, potentially questionable authenticity. The Emperor Ashoka really did try to set up a kind of Buddhist theocracy, so to speak, where, Ashoka's ideal was to have Dhamma rule the country, where it should be voluntary. You just encourage everybody to follow Dhamma. And then you don't need kings and governments and so forth, because everybody's helping each other, everyone's cooperating, everything's fine. But the Hindus were more cynical in their estimation of human nature. Like the author of the Artha Shastra, I think it's called, which was like an ancient Hindu or proto-Hindu political text. How, like a guide to kings, sort of like Machiavelli's The Prince. And really, that was just, people are just corrupt. You can't trust them to follow any code of honor. You just have to keep them ignorant and under control, which is kind of the way the West is going increasingly, especially in Europe, it seems to me. So let's see here. Yeah, there are a few guidelines on political structures, partly with regard to the Buddha's own choice of how the Sangha should be managed, and also just occasional advice with regard to, what kings ought to do, and they shouldn't be fighting wars, and they should negotiate their treaties instead of just fighting it out, that kind of thing. But he really wasn't talking a lot about politics, which is what you would expect, because the Buddha had renounced society. And back then, it was done seriously. It's not just you become part of society by becoming like the village secular priest or something, some high profile teacher that people are all coming to. It's like you seriously renounce society, and just talking about politics is animal talk. Monks should not do it. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, have you read some of the history about Haiti? it might have some similarities from what is happening in most of the Western Hemisphere. And I really know very little about the history of Haiti. I mean, it was, it's mostly a black population there who are descended from like sugarcane plantation slaves. They eventually rebelled against the white ruling class there and pretty much drove them out. That somehow I've picked up somewhere, it could just be like Christian propaganda, that Haiti, like one of their first governments, made some sort of like voodoo pact. They had some kind of voodoo thing going as a way of like strengthening their government or something, which just kind of opened the door to all sorts of malevolent influences and so forth, which is one reason why Haiti is allegedly the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It's also one of the few black majority countries in the Western Hemisphere that I've read. This is like UN, like United Nations data. I did a blog post on this years ago at this point. But according to the UN's own data, 19 of the 20 poorest countries in the world are black majority nations, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And the only of these poorest countries in the world, the 20 poorest that is in the Western Hemisphere, is Haiti, which is also a black majority country. The only of the 20 poorest countries in the world, I think it's like number 19 or 20. So it's not close to the top of the list of poorest, or bottom, however you want to look at it, is Afghanistan. So I really don't know what Siddhartha Lohachita is referring to when he says it might have some similarities from what is happening in most of the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, I don't see how most of the Western Hemisphere would be like a population of slaves that kind of perpetrate an uprising against the ruling class and drive them out. I mean, potentially the ruling class, like the elite class, can get overthrown and replaced by a different elite class, which is generally how it works. There could be some purge, and most of the elite class, they wind up going to the guillotine or whatever. And then they just get replaced by other people who, within a relatively short time, are approximately as bad as the people that were thrown out of power. But yeah, I'm not sure what Siddhartha Lohachita is referring to. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Dripwalker. And Dripwalker, first he has the context of his questions. So the context is, I have heard from an esoteric fellow that the subconscious is fully opened and can be more easily programmed. And if you're just listening to the podcast, you're missing out on all these air quotes. On full moon days. So I guess I'm going to I interrupted myself, which is very rude. So I'm just going to start off. The context: I have heard from an esoteric fellow, the subconscious is fully open and can be more easily programmed or easily reprogrammed on full moon days. This also connects to the fact that uposatha days are usually on full moon days. Does the moon and subconscious link hold any truth in reality? Well, first I would like to point out that uposatha days are not usually on full moon days. I mean, you've got the big uposatha days where the monks have to convene and recite the Patimokkha, which is on the full moon and the new moon. And then you've got the lesser, the 8-day uposatha days, which are on the half moon days. So if you include those, then the full moon uposathas are only 1 out of 4. So let's see. So an esoteric fellow says that the subconscious is fully opened and can be more easily reprogrammed on full moon days. And then he says, does the moon and subconscious link hold any truth in reality? Apparently there's some kind of connection. I mean, like, it's known that women's menstrual cycles can often synchronize with the phases of the moon. So there is that, which probably has some subconscious elements to it. I mean, I don't think the body all by itself without the mind helping to condition things would just realign the menstrual cycle with the phases of the moon. So there is that. And sometimes full moon, people can act crazier on the full moon day. But with regard to the subconscious being fully open, I'm not even sure what that means. and the subconscious is more easily reprogrammed on full moon days, maybe. But I mean, I'd like to see some kind of evidence for it, if possible, some kind of empirical evidence. But I don't think that has any real connection with uposatha. I mean, the reason why uposatha days are on the new moon and the full moon is simply because in ancient times throughout the world, pretty much, and especially in India here, it's just the phases of the moon were just the way of keeping time. I mean, that was the calendar. It was like a lunisolar calendar in ancient India, where it's the position of the full moon among the constellations determines what month it is. So I mean, it was just a way of keeping track of time. I don't think that there was any deliberate connection between the full moon and any kind of esoteric subconscious reprogramming stuff. I mean, that could be in there too, but the main reason for uposatha days being on full moons and new moons and stuff is just the phases of the moon were just the main way of keeping time. You know, it was like the ancient calendar before they had a calendar. So I guess I'll just move on to Dripwalker's next question. Could this be why uposatha days are on full moon days? Yeah, I've already pretty much answered that. I mean, they're not just on full moon days. They're on full moon days, new moon days, and if you include the days when the Sangha doesn't convene but are still considered uposatha days, when lay people come to the monastery, take 8 precepts and all that, then only 1/4 of uposatha days are full moon days. So it's mainly just a way of just the regularity. Like, we've got 7 days in the week. You know, it's just, that was kind of their equivalent. Like in the Buddhist time in ancient India, that was their equivalent to just having like a weekly calendar. And months. Because I mean, month and moon, originally a month was just, you know, from one full moon to the next full moon. Or one new moon to the next new moon. So, yeah, I don't think that uposatha days being on full moon days, like 1/4 of uposathas being on full moon days, really has anything significant. There's any significant correlation between that and any, like, spiritual influence of the full moon on the subconscious mind, anything like that. Could be in there, but I don't think it's the main reason. So, Dripwalker's third question. He says, what is the karma of jumping in front of a juggernaut? But he throughout this question, juggernaut is consistently spelled juggernaut. I'm not sure why he does this. So just, if you prefer juggernaut to juggernaut, that's fine. But I'm just going to go with the English word that doesn't have the red spell check underline under it. So what is the karma of jumping in front of a juggernaut to get crushed to death, thinking that it will give good karma from a Buddhist point of view? To give you some context, there used to be a festival in India where they would make massive mobile juggernauts of deities, which would be pushed across the streets during the festival. When the juggernauts are being moved, low-caste individuals would jump in front of the juggernaut, and get crushed to death by it. The Hindu peoples used to say that the act of jumping in front of the juggernaut would give good karma, in air quotes there. Well, I mean, technically, juggernaut comes from Jagannatha. It's like the Sanskrit Jagannatha, which literally means Lord of the world, and it was like an epithet, I think, of Vishnu. So probably all the juggernaut images were some form of Vishnu. And yeah, they'd pull these huge images through the streets, and people would like jump underneath and get crushed to death, thinking that they're getting good karma. Sort of like, you know, like the tradition of sati in India, where a widow would throw herself into her husband's funeral pyre. That was, you know, the good wife. Sati literally means like the true woman, the true wife, you know. Doesn't want to be a burden on her sons, so she just burns herself alive when her husband dies, which could really suck if she's like 30 years younger than him. So let's see, what is the karma of jumping in front of a juggernaut to get crushed to death, thinking it will give good karma? It depends on the individual, because just the act itself, like I explain, like pretty regularly, just the mere physical action itself is morally neutral. I mean, that is not what the karma is coming from. That does not generate karma. It's the mental states that generate karma. So it's like why you do it, what is your attitude while you are doing it is what really determines what kind of karma you're getting. So, I mean, if they're just completely filled with faith and they're offering themselves as a kind of sacrificial victim to the god, that kind of thing, then there could be some good karma mixed in with that. I mean, almost certainly there would be. I mean, it wouldn't be pure good karma, but there would be some good karma involved. I mean, they're not thinking so much about like committing suicide. Well, I'm not supposed to say that, am I? Not on YouTube. Well, it's like self-deleting. They're not like, I mean, the fact that according to Dripwalker here, it's mostly low caste people means that, it's mostly low caste people that are not valuing their lives enough that they want to remain alive, that they think that if they fling themselves under this giant statue as it rolls by, that they might get reborn as like a higher caste person, a more fortunate person next time. That's probably a lot of the psychology going on. And I really don't think it necessarily works that way, that just flinging yourself under a religious statue to get crushed by it isn't necessarily good karma. That's just kind of like a superstition, in my opinion. But nevertheless, even if it is a superstition, if the person's mind is like exalted, they're offering themselves to this god, like their last thoughts are like dedicated to what they consider to be the supreme god, then that's going to have some positive effect. And it probably won't be like just pure 100% bad karma that they're getting. But it's going to depend on the mental states of the individual. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, what is your opinion on the dangers of addiction to comfort? I believe it has turned Americans and Canadians into neutered indoor cats, vastly dependent on the government and thus easy to control. Well, pretty much everybody is addicted to comfort. Almost everybody prefers like pleasure to pain. They prefer comfort to discomfort. There's some tough guys, for example, that have a certain stoic indifference to discomfort. As a Buddhist monk, I mean, you're supposed to just cultivate an indifference to comfort and discomfort. That's what austerity is all about. So the dangers of addiction to comfort, I mean, most people have it to some degree. Almost everybody has it to some degree. But it's not just that has turned Americans and Canadians into neutered indoor cats. I remember when I was in Burma, I was staying at this monastery that had a fair amount of old books in the English language that I could go through. And one of them was The Hidden Persuaders, which won some kind of award. I don't know if it won a Pulitzer Prize or whatever, like back in the 1950s. And it's talking about how advertising agencies are actually hiring teams of psychologists to try to get people to like really want this stuff. And a lot of the stuff the Hidden Persuaders is talking about is, it's like talking about how they're, even back in like the 1950s, they'd be selling toasters that, I mean, it just lifts up the toast and just, I mean, you don't even have to pull it out of the toaster. It just, as soon as it's done, it just lifts up for you and you just nonchalantly pluck the toast from the top of the toaster, just making everything so easy. And women are more prone to like this stuff than men are. Like some of the stuff my woman likes, it's like, I mean, it's not really necessary. It's more cozy, it's more comfortable, it's easy. And people just like this. And then these advertising agencies with their teams of psychologists are just pounding away at it. And like they've succeeded in getting a lot of women to buy a whole different wardrobe like twice a year. It's like the winter colors this year are like earth tones, it's like, and all the women just have to rush out and get the new colors just because they're in style that year, just styles, fashion trends. And at least at the time that Hidden Persuaders was written, they were talking about how the clothing companies and the advertising agencies were just in despair because men just won't go with these fashion trends. It's a woman thing. The women go with the fashion trends much more than men do. A man is willing to wear the same suit for 20 years until it just wears out. So we're all addicted to comfort to some degree. We all prefer well-seasoned food to bland, flavorless food, for example. Most of us do. But then you have like consumer culture. Consumerism is just like, it's like, what's the word? Pandering to it, or just like trying to make us as addicted as possible so that they can sell their unnecessary junk. So it's consumerism is just aggravating the natural human preference for like convenience to inconvenience or comfort to discomfort. And that's one strength that the Burmese had. They were just completely stoic. They didn't give a shit about fashion trends other than just the tradition of, women wearing a flowered sarong and men wearing geometric patterns on their sarong, that kind of thing, it was just perennial. There's no this year's fall fashions, anything like that. So I'm just going to move on to Dhamma River's next question. Second question, he says, what's your favorite Dhamma teaching that does not come from scripture or Tripitaka? It could be a Dhamma talk available online or a book. It can be anything you've ever heard or read that you thought was a great Dhamma teaching that didn't come from scripture. Just a second, I gotta look on the bookcase here. Let's see here. This one. Let's see. Maybe, let's just go with this one. Okay. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, this would rule out stuff that isn't Dhamma. This would, because he's got the word Dhamma instead of Dharma, I'm just going to interpret that to mean Theravada Buddhism. Because Dharma with an R, that can apply to any kind of Buddhism. It can apply to Hinduism. It can apply to any kind of real spirituality that has some depth or profundity to it. So this is just going to apply to Theravada. And the first thing that came to mind is that the Ajahn Chah tradition produces for free distribution lots and lots of books that are like the teachings of Ajahn Chah, like transcripts of his Dhamma talks. And for some reason, I don't think I have any on my bookcase now. I think I left them behind when I left the monastery for the last time. But some of... those books of Ajahn Chah's Dhamma talks are good Dhamma that, it's just accessible. It's kind of more accessible to the Western mind, more so than like the Dhamma talks of a Burmese Sayadaw, because the Burmese Sayadaws are very dogmatic, very scholastic. Whereas the Thais base their teachings more on personal experience, so that sometimes they're deviating from orthodoxy. They're using Pali words without really knowing the exact meaning of the Pali word. They've interpreted the Pali word incorrectly or something, but at least they're basing it on their own experience, like their own meditative experience and insight. So sometimes a book written by a Thai Ajahn can just be funny to like some Burmese dogmatist because he's getting it wrong. It's like the Buddha didn't say that. This kind of thing. But still, a Burmese Sayadaw is so dogmatic that if their personal experience isn't the same as what the book says, they'll reject their own personal experience or just sort of force fit their personal experience to fit in with what the book says. Whereas the Thais, because they're less cognizant of what the book actually says, they'll just give their insights, based on their own meditative experience. And in some ways, it's more valid, it's more alive. It's less just dead words and more like living experience. And Ajahn Chah was really good at that. He was definitely a serious practitioner. He started off as like a scholastic teacher at some school monastery in Thailand, I'm pretty sure. But it was like his conscience would not let him rest. It's like he's teaching this stuff about how monks are supposed to live, and he wasn't doing it. So finally, he just decided, I'm just going to have to, walk the talk. I'm going to have to practice what I preach, and went out and became a meditation master. And some of his practices were relatively advanced, like sleeping with like a full bottle of water balanced on one knee and a full glass of water balanced on the other knee, just sleeping in a sitting position where if he moved at all, they would just fall off, that kind of thing. So yeah, the Dhamma talks of Ajahn Chah would be up near the top of my list. Also, the book I got off the bookcase, this would be another one. This is an important one, Concept and Reality, in early Buddhist thought by Bhikkhu Nyanananda, where the whole book is about the meaning of the word papancha. And this book revolutionized modern Buddhistic studies with regard to understanding what the word papancha means. Because the commentarial tradition didn't quite get it, and then Burmese Seatos would just slavishly follow the commentarial tradition, so they didn't quite get it either. And then Bhikkhu Nyanananda comes along and just uses this rational investigation of the text to point out that papancha really means something different from what the commentary says. And it's the opposite of nibbana. One of the synonyms for nibbana is nipapancha, which means no papancha, without papancha. So this book, Concept and Reality, which is sold by the Buddhist Publication Society, this is an important book too, which is kind of a Dhamma talk, or Dhamma teachings written by a monk, an ordained bhikkhu. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Rechte Ansicht, and I don't know how to pronounce German words correctly. So Rechte Ansicht says, did the Buddha probably look more like an Asian Nepalese, he had golden skin, than an Indian? After all, he was a Kshatriya from Lumbini, or was this area already completely Indian at that time without any Asian immigration? Well, probably the Buddha looked more European or like Iranian than he looked Indian or Nepalese. I mean, chances are the Buddha had Indo-European ancestry, so which would make him related to Europeans. I mean, according to tradition, he had blue eyes, although, I mean, that's not really historical fact, it's just a tradition. But, there are a lot of Iranian people, they have like dark eyes and dark hair, maybe a big nose, but still they've got like large, mainly like what would be called Caucasian features. I mean, they look pretty much European. And probably the Buddha looked more like that. I mean, according to tradition, he was of the ruling class, which would mean that he didn't have a whole lot of like Asiatic DNA mixed in with his DNA, unless it was like from his ancestors in like the BMAC or something. But I mean, like the highest caste Brahmins of like Rajasthan would look more like the Buddha than a Nepalese person would. I mean, the Nepalese also are, I mean, they've got like, a lot of them are fair-skinned and kind of tall and don't have sort of like the Dravidian characteristics of, I think the Dravidians of India, like most of the inhabitants of India before the Indo-Europeans arrived, were a mixture of like Mediterranean Caucasians, like the Neolithic farmers that migrated eastwards, who were interbreeding with Proto-Australoids. So the Buddha was probably like tall, fair-skinned, dark hair, blue or brown eyes, but still he would look more like, like a high caste Brahmin from Rajasthan, or like some elite Iranian, than he would like, some dark-skinned, shorter type of indigenous person from South India or the far east of India, that kind of thing. In my opinion, just going with probabilities. So let's see here. Or was that area already completely Indian at that time without any Asian immigration? Asian immigration. Well, I mean, the indigenous inhabitants of what is now Nepal would be Asian. There'd be some like people related to the Tibetans, for example, would be there. There'd be some Dravidian types in the lowlands, I would guess. But then you have like the conquering master race comes in, and they're the ruling elite, and they're mostly interbreeding amongst themselves. Like the Buddhist family was like cousins marrying each other. I think the Buddha's own wife was his cousin, like his first cousin. So it was kind of trying to keep it all, the bloodlines pure and so forth, apparently. So, yeah, there was indigenous Asians already there, but the ruling class wasn't really interbreeding with them much. It did happen, and gradually over the centuries, over the millennia, you wind up with most people in India just having brown skin and not looking particularly European, although there still are a few, mostly of the higher castes. So I guess I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to Rechte Ansicht's next question, which is, if you were to get a Buddha tattoo, on which part of the body would you put it? What would it look like? And what would the Buddha specifically look like? I'm thinking of getting a Buddha tattoo. Idolatry. But so far I've only found Buddha tattoos with feminine features or Mahayana depictions of the Buddha. I'd like one that looks more European or ancient Greek, and maybe even with a shaved head. Well, if I were to get a Buddha tattoo, on what part of the body would I put it? Gosh, I mean, this is just like completely out of left field for me. I've never considered this. What would it look like, and what would the Buddha specifically look like? I remember when I was a monk, I was toying with a certain Buddha image that would be very abstract. The Buddha's head would just be a circle. He'd be almost like a stick figure. There'd be like a triangle representing his upper robe. He'd just be sitting under a tree with a bowl in front of him. And there'd be like no facial features. It'd just be like this abstract glyph, really, like a hieroglyph of the Buddha sitting in meditation under a tree with his bowl in front of him. Just a circle for a head, maybe just a little line for the neck. Then, he'd be like sitting in the full lotus. So there'd be like the stick arms and the stick legs in the full lotus. And then just more or less like triangles representing his upper robe and maybe his lower robe, kind of a flattened out isosceles triangle or something like that. I mean, you might have the tree behind him, some sort of a very simplified, equally simplified figure of a tree. And that would be it. That'd probably be my version. I mean, I wouldn't want like a human face, like a detailed human face tattooed on my body. I just really don't swing that way. So where would I put it? Gosh, maybe on my left shoulder blade, like behind my heart. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'm not planning on it. It's extremely unlikely that I would do such a thing. So I really haven't put much thought into how I would do it. Let's see. Feminine features, Mahayana depictions of the Buddha. Yeah, well, that'd be like Kamakura Buddha isn't even Gautama Buddha. Most of the Japanese Buddha images that you see, or the Chinese Buddha image, that's not even Gautama Buddha. That's some mythological space Buddha that somebody came up with hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha. So, I mean, you could use a kind of like a Gandharan Greek motif. I mean, he'd probably still have like the top knot of hair and everything, because the Greek Buddhas were based on Apollo. But yeah, I mean, you could just do just the Buddha head, like a Gandhara Buddha head. You might want to just monkey with the details enough so that he's got a shaved head instead of long hair with a top knot. But yeah, if I was going to have a Buddha tattoo, just my first impression would be to use that image that I was toying with as a monk. That's just like a glyph of the Buddha in meditation, so that you know what it's supposed to be, even though it does not look realistic at all. It's just the Buddha with just a circle for a head. There'd be clean shaven. There'd be no little hairs sticking out. Just sitting in meditation, kind of a tree to one side behind him and his bowl in front of him, and that would be it. Maybe he'd be sitting on a sitting mat. The Nisidana, if you will. And maybe over my left shoulder blade, but then of course I'd never see it. I don't know, maybe I could put it on my shoulder or something. Maybe my left shoulder. Or let's see. Maybe the right shoulder, because then it'd show if a monk had his shoulder uncovered. Okay, but good luck with your Buddha tattoo. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, why do you think you didn't develop any psychic powers? Well, what exactly are you going to call psychic powers? There's one kind of, whether you want to call it psychic powers or not, I don't know. But for some reason, I'm really tuned into group mind stuff. It's like it fits in with my philosophy of the uncarved block of marble, where, everything in this world, the 10,000 things of this phenomenal universe are just virtual statues contained in this uncarved block. And that would include group statues. So every time you have more than one person, more than one conscious being interacting, you're creating a kind of us entity that ultimately isn't any more real than like the individual entities that are making up this us entity. But still, there's like this, in a way, it's like a higher level of consciousness, or just a different kind of consciousness that is connecting these two entities. And for some reason, like it happened last night twice, just in a matter of like 5 minutes, where I'll just blurt out exactly what my woman happens to be thinking at that time. The exact words. Like last night, it was the exact words. And then after the second time, she started getting weirded out, told me to be quiet. But stuff like that, or just like somebody who has practiced like intensive meditation, just there's all kinds of like synchronicities that spontaneously occur, just, weird manifestations of karma, that kind of thing. That, maybe you won't call it psychic powers, but it is something that is, in a way, kind of paranormal. It's not just mechanistic. It's like this karma generated, mind generated thing that's happening that is just weird. But going back to Joe Doe and his question, why do you think you didn't develop any psychic powers? First of all, I didn't give a shit about developing psychic powers. When weird stuff would happen, like the weird synchronicities, you just accept them as everyday life. If you want miracles to become commonplace, you don't single them out as a big deal. You just accept it as the flow. You're not like making any kind of like potential obstructions against it or anything like that. So the orthodox Buddhist explanation would be, you get psychic powers through like mastering jhana. And I never really fully mastered jhana. It was sort of come and go, sort of like Godika in the Samyutta Nikaya, who he would get jhana and lose it and get it and lose it and get it and lose it until he was in a state of complete desperation. I was sort of like that. And so, the psychic powers just did not reach fruition, just going with Theravada and dogma, because you get psychic powers through mastering jhana, and I just never fully mastered jhana. Although, as I say, just there is stuff that happens, like the group mind stuff, where I'm just kind of tapping into what both of us are just feeling the same thing or thinking the same words, the exact same words at the exact same time, that kind of thing. Because I just blurted it out as she was thinking it. Twice. In like 5 minutes. But in a way, you could say, well, we know each other well enough, and we're just sort of, in tune with each other, where our vibes are in sync or whatever, which can just cause that to spontaneously happen sometimes. So that's my answer, I guess. And I'm moving on to Joe Doe's next question, which is, do you know much about Helena Blavatsky? Was she a fraud? I think I answered a question about Madame Blavatsky just a week or two ago. Anyways, Helena Blavatsky, was she a fraud? That's a tough question, because I do have another book on the bookcase back there. I won't go get it. The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, where he talks about how even genuine psychics will still do like trickster stuff. You know, there will be fraud mixed in with the genuine psychic stuff because it makes them more liminal. They're breaking rules. You know, breaking rules is liminal. And so when you're throwing in a bunch of fake stuff, it kind of, it's like priming the pump for the real stuff to happen more often. So it is true that Helena Blavatsky was committing some fraudulent stuff. Like, she's supposedly getting these notes from ascended masters in the Himalayas that would fall onto the table during their seances or whatever they call them. You know, these little notes would just fall out of midair and just land on the table. And it turns out that Helena Blavatsky had they were tied to a thread, and they were wedged up in the cracks of the ceiling, and she'd just give it a little tug at the right moment, and it would just fall onto the table in this little puff of attic dust. But just because she would do that doesn't mean she was a 100% absolute complete fraud. And her cohort, Colonel Alcott, seems to have held her in very high esteem. He thought she was the real deal. Maybe he could be up and just doing some fraud stuff too, though, I guess. But I've tried to read some of her stuff, and she's just, you know, it's almost like reading Nietzsche, where it's just so stream of consciousness, emotional, poetic stuff, that it just doesn't jive with my way of thinking. I'm just more objective, linear thought. I mean, I can enjoy words with more than one meaning, which sort of, you know, kind of complicates the linear thought stuff. But still, she was just too surreal in her approach that I really could not get into it. But she definitely was doing some fraud stuff, but that does not guarantee that she was just completely a fraud. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. Yeah, I think we're going to be less than 2 hours here because we're getting close to the bottom. Ethiopian Fake Tig says, Epicurus had a very Buddhist philosophy. Only thing he couldn't do was meditate, so he settled for happy thoughts instead. What are your thoughts on Epicureanism? Well, I mean, I have read some philosophy books, and really it seems to me like if you're going to look to the classical West, you know, Greco-Roman classicism, that Epicureanism did not come closest to Buddhism. That Epicureanism came closest to scientism or just materialism. That probably the closest philosophy to Buddhism that I'm aware of would be the Cynics, you know, Diogenes the Cynic, at least with regard to their lifestyle. They came much closer to Buddhism. Also, I mean, some of the Orphic mysteries, Pythagoreans that believed in rebirth and so forth, probably would come closer to Epicureans, who tended to be materialistic. I mean, they've been compared to the Charvakas of ancient India, just the worldly philosophers, the atheist philosophers. The Epicureans believed that there were gods, but didn't think that they really interacted with people. They had their own world and just didn't give a shit about us, which comes kind of close to Buddhist philosophy. I'm not sure what kind of morals the Epicureans had. There were a lot of, in the Roman Republic, there were a lot of Epicurean types that really just were not religious. You know, they preferred a kind of rationalistic understanding of reality. So, I mean, there's certain Buddhist elements in Epicureanism. You know, I think Epicureanism is just based on, and again, it's like the Charvakas of ancient India, where pleasure is the highest good. You know, to be happy or just to experience pleasure and avoid pain was just the highest good. And so the Charvakas, who wrote the Kama Sutra is a Charvaka text. You know, they're just making this science of how to maximize pleasure. And of course, you have to use some common sense. Just overindulgence can backfire. You know, overindulgence in food results in obesity and impaired health and so forth. And overindulgence in euphoric drugs, You can result in, again, impaired health, addiction, crash and burn, that kind of stuff. So, Epicurus, I mean, he still believed that pleasure is the highest good, I'm pretty sure. It's just that he believed in just sort of moderation and just subtle pleasures rather than just going for it as a complete hedonist. So let's see, what's the question here? What are your thoughts on Epicureanism? Yeah, the Epicureans, it was sort of like closet atheists, just people that just believe what they could see and hear. Those would be the Epicureans of like the late Roman Republic, for example. One of the most influential like literary works in Latin in ancient times, like the Roman Republic, would be De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. And it was an Epicurean text. I don't think Epicurus didn't write it. It was an Epicurean philosopher or poet who wrote the thing, and it was very influential. There were a lot of people who considered De Rerum Natura to be, practically scripture. And it's just based on like molecules, like atoms, and just the mechanistic universe, really. So I do think that cynicism would come closer to Buddhism than Epicureanism would. Maybe some of the mystery sects, the Stoics, that kind of thing. But I'm no authority on Epicurus or Epicureanism. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Ethiopian Fake Tig. He says, if the Buddha ever met Jesus, who do you think would have more influence on whom, since both were in their own way philosophers and such? Well, I would assume, as a Buddhist, it is a very convenient working hypothesis that the Buddha really was enlightened, or as enlightened as it is possible for a human to be. So I really don't think that he was particularly, what's the word? Not open to suggestion, but what's the word? It's like, there's a certain word I'm trying to think of where just impressionable. I think that's close to the word I was looking for anyway. Where that he's just going to like change his way of thinking just because somebody says something. He'd already, just experienced ultimate reality. That he already knew whatever needed to be known, that he didn't need to like get any kind of new knowledge or new perspective on things, that he was already there. So I don't think that Jesus would have influenced the Buddha much at all, especially considering that Jesus was going with a relatively, in my opinion, a relatively crude, like religious system. He was essentially a Hebrew with relatively crude understanding of what God is all about and so forth. So, yeah, I don't think that the Buddha would have been much influenced by Jesus. It's possible that Jesus would have been influenced more by the Buddha than vice versa. Especially if Jesus wasn't fully enlightened and didn't consider himself to be fully enlightened. If you go with the New Testament, Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the New Testament, Jesus wept. And, he'd get depressed and upset and in bad moods and so forth. And, he's like taking some knotted cords and using them as a whip to drive the money changers out of the temple and overturning their tables and so forth. So, in my opinion, it is much more questionable that Jesus was enlightened than that the Buddha was enlightened. Obviously, because I'm a Buddhist, I would assume that the Buddha was at least as wise as Jesus was, and probably wiser, because it's hard for me to believe that Jesus of Nazareth was a fully enlightened being, much less the only begotten Son of God and the creator of the universe. So, I think that the Buddha would have more influence on Jesus than vice versa. And of course, there are quite a few people who think that Jesus in his lost years actually went to Asia and became a Buddhist. But that's pretty hard for me to swallow also. So I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's third question. which is, what are your thoughts on dzogchen meditation? Been doing it for a while now, and it seems to be significantly easier than vipassana. And I've never practiced dzogchen. I've heard a little bit about it, like I've read a little bit about it, and apparently it's similar to like shikantaza in Zen Buddhism. It's just like a wide open kind of meditation, similar to what I was practicing for most of the time that I was a monk. But I really don't know enough about like official orthodox orthoprax dzogchen to really make any kind of statements about it, because I just have never done it. I've just picked up a few tidbits of information about it, about how it is really just like a wide open, like there's no primary object to it. You're just kind of making your mind spacious and open and silent kind of a thing, which is what I was practicing. So it's good, seems to me. But I really could not compare it with vipassana meditation, which isn't even really, I don't know who came up with the idea of calling mindfulness meditation vipassana meditation, when vipassana is just insight that arises spontaneously as a result of certain practices, or it can just arise spontaneously due to life experiences. So it'd be more correctly called satipatthana, or just mindfulness meditation, than calling a meditation technique vipassana, when vipassana is not a meditation technique. It is insight that arises spontaneously, often as a result of meditation, but it could be even jhana meditation that results in vipassana insight arising. But my thoughts on dzogchen meditation are very few, because I've never practiced it, I've never really studied it, and I've never really conversed with anybody who has practiced it or studied it. And so it's best for me just to move on to the next question, which is the last question. And this is from Avenity. And Avenity says, in Christianity, it is sometimes believed that your very last action or thought before dying is much more important than any you had before, as long as you turn to God at the very last moment. How are one's last thoughts or actions viewed in Theravada? Do they have any significance in the cycle of rebirth? Well, first I would say that it's kind of surprising to me that they believe this in Christianity. That it would seem like just whenever it is that you turn to God, and became like a devout Christian, that would be the most important moment. It just seems to me that in Christianity, just whenever you became like a serious devout Christian and were saved, that would be the most important moment of your life, the moment in which you were saved. Not necessarily the last moment. That's more of an Eastern thing, it seems to me. Like the Hindus definitely believe that. That's why, as I've said before, when Mahatma Gandhi was shot, he didn't say, "Oh God, like they got me," like in the movie starring Ben Kingsley that came out in like 1980 something. It was, "Hey Ram." He says, "Hey Ram," as he's dying, because he wants his last thought to be focused on God. And in Theravada Buddhism, really, it's your last thought. First of all, it's your very last thought that determines your bhavanga chitta in your next life. Bhavanga is like, if you're not thinking anything, there's just like this static test pattern of your last image, your last perceptual image in the previous life. So that's going to be following you your whole next life will be your last thought in your previous life. That's according to Abhidhamma, but the suttas really don't say anything about it. So feel free to be skeptical as you please on that one. But also, it's really your last thought in this life is going to be the most important one for determining your first thought in your next life, because there's no gap. It's just, less than a trillionth of a second when this last thought in this life blinks out and then first thought in the next life blinks in. So you've got like this momentum going. And so your last thought in this life is really going to be the most important thought for determining what your next life is going to be. It's not going to determine all the details of your next life, because you got a whole bunch of karma that's going to be conditioning that. And it may be, like I've mentioned this just recently in a Q&A. Let's say you're just a shitty person, not you necessarily of vanity, but, a person is just, they're just a criminal. They're like a mafia hitman. And then, like, as they're dying, they just have like this epiphany. It's just, they see the light and everything, and they die in this state of rapture, which apparently does happen sometimes, not necessarily with mafia hitmen, but with people in general, sometimes just normie type people. And then that would result in him getting a better rebirth, but still he's got all this bad karma, this baggage of bad karma from killing people and so forth, that's going to muck up that next life. He might be reborn as, some prince, in living in a palace or something, but he's going to be like this rotten, like Commodus type prince who's just going to be all strung out on drugs and, molesting slave girls and all this kind of stuff. And so it's going to mess up his life. On the other hand, you can have a person who's very virtuous, and then let's say they die in agony and they're just like cursing as they die, which would then cause them to go into like a worse state. But they've got so much good karma that it may be they're not going to stay in that lower realm or whatever for very long, or it's going to be very much mitigated by all this merit that they brought with them. So your very last thought isn't like determining what your next life is going to be like completely, but it is the most important moment for determining what your next, like what realm of existence you're going to be in, like what is your heading. It's determining what direction you're heading as you die, so that you'll hit the next life, in that direction. So you die with a heavenly mind, you're more likely to get a heavenly existence. You die with a demonic, hellish kind of a mind, you're more likely to get a demonic, hellish kind of existence. You die with like a sort of a ghost-like mind, whatever that is, just sort of like a surreal, dreamy kind of mind. Then you might wind up in a surreal, dreamy kind of ghost realm, that sort of thing. Most humans apparently die with more or less of a human mind, and so they wind up being a human again, which is as it should be, I suppose, since most of their karma is human karma, at least what they've been cultivating recently. So, yeah, one's last thoughts or actions viewed in Theravada, it is considered to be important. And there is some emphasis on this, like in Burmese tradition. There was, I can't remember who it was. I think he was like a government minister, like back in like the 1950s, whose wife was on her deathbed, and she was having some sort of like nightmarish experience with hellhounds coming to get her, drag her down into hell. And I think he himself, or maybe his mother-in-law, or somebody sat next to her bed and were like, urging her to think about the meritorious acts she had done and sort of distract her from the hellhounds and get her thoughts on something good as she was dying. And then it worked, and she kind of went into this state of bliss and was smiling, and the hellhounds were gone, and she wound up dying in a positive mental state. But they do say that your whole life is really just kind of rehearsing for the last moment of your life, because that's the one that's going to determine what happens after you die. It's what they say anyhow. And I do think it does seem to be much more important in Buddhism and also in Hinduism than in Christianity. Because really, it seems to me like the most important moment of your life as a Christian is the moment in which you turn to God and are saved. So that's it, I guess. I think I answered that question. So, as I should always say at the beginning, and pretty much never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer. I mean, there's no guarantee I'll be able to answer it. Like dzogchen, I just couldn't answer that one. But if you think I can answer it, it's about Dhamma, Dharma, early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism especially, just monasticism, meditation, that kind of stuff. Feel free to ask, and I will give it a shot. I will try to answer your question if it is a question that I perceive to be in good faith. If it's just like some wiseacre joke question kind of a thing, there are no guarantees. I mean, I could just throw it in for comic relief or something. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy and stuff.